The day had started just like any other. The sun had climbed up into the sky, painting the town in a soft glow. The streets were busy with people heading to work, children walking to school, and vendors setting up their stalls. Among the movement and noise, one man moved quietly. He was dressed simply, nothing about him stood out. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary person going about his routine. He parked his car near the square, stepped out, and closed the door with calm care. There was no rush in his steps, no urgency in his actions. He glanced once at the car, almost like someone looking at an old companion, and then walked toward a small cafe across the street. It was not just any car to him. It carried years of memories, late-night drives, long journeys, and even quiet evenings parked outside his home. Though modest, it had been by his side for many years. He had never cared much for luxury. What mattered to him was reliability and trust, qualities that meant more than a shiny brand name. That morning, as he left the car and made his way down the street, he carried the peace of a man who had nothing to prove. A few streets away, however, not everyone carried that calm. A group of officers had been moving about since early morning. Their faces showed irritation, as if the day had already tested their patience. Maybe it was the heat, maybe it was the constant stream of small tasks and endless complaints, but something in their mood was restless. They were looking for an outlet, something to ease the burden of their own frustration. It was unfortunate that the man's parked car caught their attention. They walked around it with sharp eyes, not in the careful way that good officers should, but in the careless manner of people searching for trouble where none existed. One of them pointed at the car, and the others nodded. Their words were sharp, carrying assumptions rather than facts. They spoke as if they had already judged the unseen owner. The man, sitting quietly inside the cafe, could see through the window. His seat faced the street, and from where he sat, the sight of the officers circling his car was clear. He raised his cup of tea, paused midway, and placed it back down. His eyes did not widen, his mouth did not open in protest. He just observed, calm and steady, as if he had expected this kind of day to arrive sooner or later. People around the cafe had noticed too. A couple of young men standing nearby pulled out their phones. They started recording, whispering to each other about what was happening. At first, no one thought it would turn into something serious. But as the officers' tone grew louder and their gestures more aggressive, the crowd's interest deepened. Passers-by slowed down, choosing to watch rather than hurry along to their destinations. The man's silence was unusual. Anyone else might have rushed out immediately, shouted in defense, or at least demanded an explanation. But he sat still, as if he were giving them space to show who they really were. There was no fear in his face, only patience, like someone who knew the weight of time and the value of self-control. The officers, on the other hand, began to enjoy the attention. Their words became more dramatic, as if they were performing for the small audience gathering around. They treated the car like a problem that needed solving, when in reality it was simply parked where many others were. Their arrogance pushed them further, and they convinced themselves that they were right, even though deep down they knew they were going too far. The man folded his hands on the table, leaning slightly forward, his gaze never leaving the scene. In his eyes there was no anger, just a quiet sadness that this was the state of things. He could hear the faint comments of people in the cafe behind him. Some whispered in sympathy, others shook their heads in disapproval of the officer's behavior. Everyone seemed to agree that what was happening was wrong, yet no one dared to step in. Minutes passed, but each second stretched longer. The man finally rose from his seat. He left a few coins on the table, nodded politely at the server, and walked outside. His steps were steady, not rushed. Each one felt deliberate, as though he knew the moment he arrived at his car, something would change. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, curious to see what he would do. The officers turned their eyes to him, scanning him up and down as if he were just another citizen to control. They asked questions not to understand, but to show dominance. He listened quietly, let their words hang in the air, and then answered in a tone so calm it almost unsettled them. His voice carried respect, but also firmness. Yet instead of recognizing it, the officers only grew more irritated. The crowd grew larger, phones recording from every angle. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into hushed outrage. Everyone could sense that this was not just a simple matter of a parked car. Something deeper was unfolding. The man, still calm, looked at the car that had served him for years, and then back at the officers who stood puffed up with pride. In that moment, he knew that silence was his best tool. By not revealing who he really was, he gave them every chance to correct themselves, to act with dignity. But as the day would soon prove, their choices would lead them down a path they could not escape. The air felt heavy, charged with the tension of what was about to come. And though no one knew yet, this ordinary morning was about to turn into a lesson that the entire town and the officers themselves would never forget. The man stood there quietly, his calm presence almost strange in the heated moment. The officers, already fueled by irritation, looked at him like he was nothing more than an obstacle in their way. One of them stepped closer, speaking loudly so everyone could hear, as if volume alone could prove his authority. He questioned the man harshly, not allowing him the chance to answer fully. Every time the man tried to speak, his words were cut off by interruptions, laughter, or sharp remarks. The crowd shifted uneasily. People had seen arguments before, but this felt different. There was no balance, no fairness. The man was standing quietly, responding with short, respectful words, but the officers treated him with suspicion, as if silence was guilt. A woman in the crowd whispered, "He doesn't look like he's done anything." Another added, "Why don't they just listen to him?" Yet no one spoke up louder than a whisper, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. The man's hands remained loose by his sides. He didn't clench his fists, didn't raise his voice. He simply let the officers continue. In his eyes, there was no panic, only patience. He knew that truth didn't need to fight to be seen, it always revealed itself in time. Still, watching his car surrounded, hearing the sharp tones of those who should have shown discipline, a quiet sadness grew inside him. One of the officers moved toward the car, tapping on the hood, circling around it like a hunter circling prey. "This looks suspicious," he said loudly, glancing at the crowd as if seeking approval. Another officer nodded, agreeing without evidence. They started speaking of violations that didn't exist, making assumptions with each passing second. The man finally spoke up, explaining that it was his car, legally parked, that everything was in order. But his words were dismissed as if they carried no weight. The crowd murmured again. Some shook their heads, others pulled their phones higher to record. A young man near the front whispered, "This doesn't feel right. Why are they pushing it so far?" His friend replied softly, "Because they think he's powerless." The man's steady voice, though calm, only seemed to provoke the officers more. They mistook patience for weakness, humility for fear. One officer smirked, stepping closer until his shadow fell across the man's face. "So this is your car?" he asked with a mocking tone. "Then maybe you should take better care of it." The crowd stiffened at the insult, their unease now turning into quiet disapproval. Instead of reacting with anger, the man simply nodded, repeating in a soft tone that the car was his, that he had the papers if they wanted to see them. But the officers had no interest in papers. They wanted a show, something that made them look powerful in front of the gathering eyes. Each word they threw out wasn't meant to solve anything, it was meant to humiliate. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The man remained a pillar of calm, his voice steady, his posture upright. Every time the officers mocked him or accused him without reason, he responded in the same manner, calm, respectful, but firm. It was as if he was giving them every possible chance to choose the right path. Yet the more chances they received, the more they wasted them. The atmosphere around the square thickened. The cafe workers leaned against the doorway. The vendors stopped arranging their stalls. Even the children walking by slowed to a halt. All eyes were on this one corner where a man stood facing a group of officers who seemed determined to prove something. One officer finally ordered another to check inside the car. The man raised his hand slightly, not in aggression, but in a simple request to wait. "Please," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There is no reason for this," the officer scoffed, brushing past him without listening. They yanked the door open, searching through the car with careless hands, tossing aside the few things inside. A scarf was thrown to the ground, a small notebook flipped and stepped on. The man's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that their disrespect had touched him. Still, he didn't lash out. He simply watched. The crowd gasped as the officers handled the belongings with such disregard. A man from the crowd muttered under his breath, "This is going too far." Another whispered, "Why doesn't he stop them?" No one knew that he had reasons for his silence, reasons that would soon become clear. As the search dragged on with nothing to be found, the frustration of the officers grew sharper. Their tone became harsher, their actions less controlled. They spoke louder, trying to cover up their lack of results with more aggression. The man stood by, allowing them to finish their act. His silence was not weakness, but a mirror showing them to the crowd for exactly who they were. The air carried a strange tension, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. The people watching felt they were standing at the edge of something bigger, something about to unfold. They couldn't quite name it, but they sensed it in the man's quiet strength, in the officer's restless arrogance. Every word, every movement felt like a step closer to something no one could stop. By now, nearly the entire square had turned into an audience. What had begun as a simple moment around a parked car had transformed into a stage, with actors playing their parts, though not everyone knew the script. The man stood in the center of it all, still calm, still patient, still waiting. And as the crowd watched, the officers, blind to who they were really dealing with, prepared to take their arrogance one step further. The square had grown strangely quiet, the kind of silence that happens when people sense something is about to go wrong. The officers had pulled everything out of the car and left it scattered on the ground. Nothing suspicious had been found, but that didn't stop them. Their frustration only grew stronger, and with it came a hunger to prove themselves right in front of the growing crowd. The man stood nearby, watching with calm eyes. His scarf lay in the dirt, his notebook now trampled under a boot, yet he didn't raise his voice. He simply observed, his hands steady by his sides. The crowd's whispers grew louder, filled with disbelief at the officer's behavior. A woman whispered to her friend, "Why are they doing this?" "They didn't find anything." Another man shook his head, saying softly, "They're trying to make a scene out of nothing." The officers, ignoring the murmurs, moved closer together, speaking in low voices but loud enough for people to catch bits and pieces. Their words carried arrogance, as if destroying the car would be the only way to make their pride feel safe. One of them kicked at the car door, denting the metal. The sharp sound rang out through the square, causing the crowd to gasp. Children clung to their parents, unsure why those meant to protect were now acting like aggressors. The man's expression didn't change. He watched with the same steady gaze, though inside, his heart sank. That car had carried him through countless days and nights, through storms, through quiet drives home. It wasn't just metal and wheels, it was a piece of his life. To see it treated like trash struck a deep chord within him. Yet still he stayed silent. His silence was not weakness, but a lesson he was letting them write for themselves. Then came the moment that no one expected. One officer, his face twisted with pride and recklessness, pulled something from his pocket. A small lighter flicked open in his hand. The crowd stirred instantly, voices rising in disbelief. "No!" someone cried out. "They wouldn't dare!" Another said, their voice shaky. But before anyone could move, the officer crouched near the car and let the flame catch on a rag thrown carelessly near the fuel line. In seconds, fire licked at the car's side, orange sparks dancing in the air. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts. Phones shot higher into the air, recording every second of what was happening. Smoke began to rise, dark and heavy, curling into the blue sky. The car's paint began to blister, the flames crawling across the surface like wild vines. The man's chest tightened, his breath catching as he watched years of memories burn in front of him. Still, his face remained calm. He did not scream, did not run forward to stop them. His eyes, steady and piercing, stayed locked on the growing fire. The officers laughed, proud of their reckless act, their arrogance now fully exposed. They looked at the crowd, as if daring anyone to question them, but the crowd wasn't laughing. Fear and anger spread through the onlookers. Parents shielded their children's eyes, vendors stepped back from their stalls, people shook their heads in disbelief. One older man whispered to no one in particular, "This isn't law. This is madness." The crowd knew what they were witnessing was not justice, it was abuse of power. The fire grew stronger, crackling as it devoured the seats, the dashboard, the wheels. Glass shattered from the heat, sending tiny shards onto the street. The man's belongings inside were gone in seconds, swallowed by the flames. Yet he still stood firm, his silence more powerful than any outburst could have been. The officers didn't see it, but the crowd did. The man's calmness was louder than their shouting. His patience carried more weight than their reckless destruction. His steady presence, even in the face of such loss, made people wonder who he really was. No ordinary person could stand so composed in such a moment. Something about him felt different, deeper, as if he held a secret that none of them knew. One child tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why isn't he crying?" The mother could only shake her head, watching with wide eyes. Even the people recording began to lower their phones for a moment, realizing this was no ordinary scene. They weren't just recording a fire, they were recording the birth of a story that would spread far beyond that square. The flames roared higher, filling the air with smoke. The heat was felt even from a distance, forcing the crowd to step back. Still, the man remained rooted where he stood, his eyes never leaving the burning car. His silence became heavier, almost unbearable for those watching. It was as if he was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. The officers, blind in their pride, didn't sense the shift in the air. They thought they had won, that they had shown power and control. They stood tall, mocking smiles on their faces, convinced they had humiliated a helpless man in public. But the truth was far from their imagination. They had only built a stage for their own downfall, and as the smoke curled higher and the fire ate away at what was once a trusted companion of the man, the crowd knew one thing for certain: something bigger was coming. The man had yet to speak his final word, yet to reveal the truth that would change everything. The fire burned, but the silence burned deeper. And soon, that silence would break in a way the officers would never forget. The fire was still roaring, black smoke curling into the bright sky. The car that had carried the man for so many years was now nothing more than a shell covered in flames. The officers stood back with smug faces, their laughter echoing against the walls of nearby buildings. They thought they had won. To them, this was a display of strength, a warning to anyone who might dare to question their authority. But the crowd didn't see strength. They saw arrogance. They saw abuse of power. They saw the very people meant to protect the community destroying something that was not theirs, while the owner stood silently, watching his life's memories turn into ashes. Parents clutched their children, whispering about how wrong this was. Young people with phones continued recording, their cameras capturing every flicker of flame, every smirk on the officers' faces, every second of the man's calm silence. Finally, the man stepped forward. His slow, deliberate steps silenced the murmurs of the crowd. Even the crackling fire seemed quieter as he approached the officers. His face was calm, his voice steady, but his presence carried a weight that made the crowd lean closer. Waiting for what he would say, the officers turned toward him, their smirks fading just slightly. They hadn't expected him to move so boldly. One of them sneered and said, "What? You going to complain now?" Too late for that. His voice was loud, full of arrogance, but beneath it, there was the faintest hint of unease. The man didn't shout back. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather case. He opened it carefully, almost with respect, and held it up for everyone to see. The golden badge inside gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol that carried more power than all the officers' shouting and arrogance combined. The crowd gasped. Whispers turned into a wave of shock that spread through the square. "He's the sheriff," someone whispered. Another voice rose louder. "Oh my God. He's the sheriff." Phone zoomed in, capturing the badge shining in the man's steady hand. The officers froze. Their smirks disappeared, their faces pale and stiff. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence was heavy, pressing down on them harder than the smoke from the fire. Their eyes darted between the badge and the man holding it, and realization finally crashed over them. The man they had mocked, humiliated, and wronged wasn't just an ordinary citizen. He was their superior, their sheriff, the leader of their department. The sheriff's eyes swept over them slowly, calm but sharp. His voice cut through the silence, steady and controlled, yet filled with weight. "Is this how you serve the people? Is this how you wear that uniform?" His words weren't shouted, but they struck harder than any yell could have. Each one carried the disappointment of a man who had dedicated his life to justice, now watching those meant to uphold it destroy it instead. The officers shifted uneasily, their hands twitching at their sides. None of them could meet his eyes. They looked down, ashamed, their arrogance collapsing under the truth. The sheriff's calmness had always been his strength, and now, in this moment, it was crushing them far more than anger ever could. The crowd erupted, voices rising in outrage and disbelief. "They burned the sheriff's car." Someone shouted. "They treated their own sheriff like that." Another cried. The videos being recorded were already spreading across social media, carrying the story beyond the square. What had begun as a quiet morning had now turned into a public scandal that would shake the town for days to come. The sheriff lowered the badge but didn't put it away. He kept it visible, a reminder to the officers of who he was and what they had done. He spoke again, his voice calm but piercing. "Respect is not demanded. It is earned. Authority is not about power. It is about responsibility." His words hung in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone listening. The officers tried to speak, stumbling over excuses, but their voices faltered. Every attempt to defend themselves sounded hollow, meaningless compared to the reality of the burning car beside them. Their pride had turned to fear, their arrogance to shame. They knew their careers were no longer in their hands. The sheriff turned away from them and faced the crowd. His expression softened slightly, his eyes meeting those who had witnessed everything. "You have seen what happens when those trusted to protect forget their duty," he said. "This will not be ignored. Justice will be done." The crowd erupted again, this time in support. People clapped, cheered, some even called out words of respect. The sheriff had not needed to raise his voice, had not needed to strike back. His patience, his calm presence, and the simple reveal of who he was had been enough to turn the entire situation around. The officers stood frozen, their heads hanging low, realizing the weight of their actions. What they thought was a moment of control had turned into the greatest mistake of their careers. They had burned a man's car to prove their power, not knowing that the man standing before them was the one person they should have respected most. The fire still crackled behind them, But the real fire was now in the hearts of the crowd. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and they would not forget it. The sheriff's calm voice and steady hand had revealed everything, and now nothing could undo it. The moment felt larger than life, like something that would be told for years to come. And though the officers wished they could erase what they had done, it was far too late. The truth was out, and the sheriff had spoken. The fire had finally died down, leaving behind nothing but a smoking shell where the car once stood. The crowd remained in the square, their voices buzzing with disbelief and outrage. People pointed at the officers, their words sharp with anger, while others turned their eyes to the sheriff, waiting to see what he would do next. The officers, who only minutes ago had stood with puffed-up pride, now looked like shadows of themselves. Their shoulders slumped, their faces pale, their arrogance burned away with the flames. The sheriff stood quietly, his badge still visible in his hand. He didn't shout, didn't let his anger take control. Instead, he took a slow breath and spoke in the same steady tone that had carried him through years of service. "Every action has consequences," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "And today, you chose your actions." His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced every whisper. The officers shuffled uncomfortably, their eyes darting from the sheriff to the crowd. They wanted to defend themselves, but the evidence was undeniable. Dozens of phones had captured the entire scene, every insult, every reckless action, every second of the fire that consumed the car. There was no excuse left to hide behind. The sheriff turned to one of the bystanders, a young man still holding up his phone. "Keep recording," he said. "The truth should be seen." The young man nodded quickly, his hands shaking slightly, realizing the importance of what he was documenting. With that, the sheriff stepped closer to the officers. His calmness was like a mirror, forcing them to look at themselves clearly for the first time. "This uniform," he said, pointing to the badges on their chests, "is not a shield to abuse. It is a promise to serve, to protect, to respect. When you forget that, you betray not only the people, but yourselves." The words sank deep. The officers lowered their heads, knowing there was no way out. The sheriff's quiet authority had stripped away their pride, leaving only the truth. Around them, the crowd began to speak again, but this time their voices carried hope. People cheered for the sheriff, clapping their hands, shouting words of support. "That's real leadership." One man called out, "This is the kind of justice we need." A woman added, tears in her eyes. The sheriff didn't bask in the praise. He simply nodded to the crowd, his face steady, his eyes calm. Then he turned back to the officers and said, "You will answer for this. Today will not be forgotten." His words sealed their fate. The once proud men who had mocked him now stood frozen, awaiting the consequences they knew were coming. Within hours, news spread across the town. Videos of the burning car and the sheriff's reveal flooded social media, watched by thousands within minutes. Headlines appeared online. "Officers burned sheriff's car in shocking abuse of power," and "Sheriff stays calm as his own men humiliate themselves." The story was everywhere, and the town could talk about nothing else. The officers were suspended immediately, their actions condemned by leaders and citizens alike. Investigations began, and their future in the department grew darker with every passing hour. Their arrogance had destroyed not just a car, but their own reputations. The sheriff, however, walked through the storm with quiet dignity. He gave no angry speeches, no harsh words. Instead, he continued to remind people of what true leadership meant. "Authority is not about showing power," he told reporters. "It's about showing responsibility. If I had raised my voice, if I had fought back, this moment would have been lost." But sometimes silence teaches louder than shouting. The people admired him more than ever. They saw a man who had endured humiliation without breaking, who had watched his own property destroyed, but still stood taller than those who tried to bring him down. His patience had revealed the truth more clearly than any fight could have done in the days that followed. The burned car remained in the lot, blackened and broken, a quiet reminder of what had happened. Some wanted it removed immediately, but the sheriff requested it stay a little longer. "Let people see it," he said. "Let them remember what arrogance destroys and what patience reveals." The car became a symbol, a silent monument that told a story without words. Children pointed to it as they walked by with their parents. "That's the sheriff's car," they'd whisper. And the parents would nod, adding, "And that's what happens when people forget their duty." The sheriff himself did not dwell on the loss. To him, the car was gone, but the lesson remained. What mattered more was that the community had seen the truth with their own eyes, and that the trust between people and justice could be rebuilt stronger than before. Weeks later, during a small town gathering, people approached him with gratitude. They thanked him for his calmness, for showing strength without anger, for proving that justice still had a place in their lives. He accepted their words with humility, always reminding them that the real power belonged to the people themselves. In the end, the story was not just about a burned car. It was about patience, dignity, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It was about how one man's calm silence revealed the truth louder than fire, louder than arrogance, louder than anything else. And as he walked through the town one evening, the sheriff passed the blackened remains of his old car. He paused for just a moment, his eyes steady, his heart calm. Then he turned away, walking forward with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove, because the truth had already spoken for him.